When me and my troublemaking friends were 13 years old, one of the many rowdy and mischievous things we would do was Saturday night ding-dong ditch sessions. This was about 10 years ago, and we all lived on the same block in what seemed like a typical suburban neighborhood. Though back then, there were a lot more woods scattered between houses than there are now. Those patches of forest would end up saving our lives that night, though we didn't know it yet. I'm going to use fake names for this story to protect everyone's identity. There was Mark, James, and Matt. The four of us had been pulling this prank for months without any real consequences. Either Mark or James would usually volunteer to actually ring the doorbells, while Matt and I preferred to find good hiding spots right away. We had it down to a science. That particular Saturday night started like any other. We met up around 9 p.m. after it got dark, hyped each other up and headed out to cause some harmless trouble. Or what we thought was harmless anyway. We hit about 5 or 6 houses on our block first, just to warm up. Most of the reactions were pretty predictable and honestly kind of boring. Middle-aged guys would step out onto their stoops, look around confused, maybe yell, "Hey," or "I see you," even though they clearly didn't, then shuffle back inside, shaking their heads. For a couple of houses where the reactions were particularly weak, we'd wait a few minutes and ring the bell again, just to get them more worked up. One guy threatened to call the cops the second time around, so when he slammed his door, we all took off running and decided to try our luck on the next block over. Like I mentioned before, 10 years ago, this neighborhood had these patches of undeveloped wooded areas sitting where new construction houses stand today. The next block we hit had several of these wooded spots surrounding some of the houses, and the houses themselves on this street seemed more run down and neglected than on our own street. We should have taken that as a warning sign, but we were 13 and stupid. The first house we approached was directly across the street from a decent-sized patch of woods, maybe 30 or 40 feet deep with thick brush and trees. It was perfect for hiding. The house itself looked pretty rough, even in the darkness. I could make out tall, unmowed grass, probably knee-high, and there was a ratty old car sitting in the driveway with a weathered cover thrown over it. The whole property just had this neglected, forgotten vibe to it. The kind of place where you could tell nobody gave a shit about maintaining appearances. Mark volunteered to ring this one. He was always the boldest of our group. He jogged across the street toward the front door, and I swear he barely had his finger off the doorbell before the door flew open. It happened so fast it actually startled all of us. The man who appeared in the doorway was huge. I'd guess he was about 6 feet tall, maybe even a bit taller, with this stocky, powerful build. Unlike every other person we'd pranked that night, this guy didn't seem confused at all. He was immediately, intensely furious. His face was red even in the dim porch light, and you could see the anger radiating off him. He stomped down off his porch and started circling around his entire front yard with these heavy, deliberate steps, checking behind bushes, looking under his covered car, the whole time yelling threats at whoever had rung his bell. Stuff like, "When I find you, you're dead," and "Come out here, you little shit." We all tried to stifle our nervous laughter from across the street in the woods, like we always did, but something felt different this time. His anger seemed too real, too immediate. After what felt like 5 minutes, but was probably closer to 2, he finally stormed back inside his house, slamming the door hard enough that we could hear it from across the street. We waited, letting our heartbeats slow down. Mark checked the windows from his hiding spot near the side of the house, making sure the guy wasn't watching. Then, because Mark was either brave or stupid, probably both, he crept back up to the door to ring it again. I wouldn't have done it. I would have said we got our thrill and moved on to another house, but Mark was committed, and we watched from the woods as he reached up and pressed that doorbell one more time. This time, the door opened even faster, and this time, the man didn't come out empty-handed. He was holding a rifle. Not like he was carrying it casually, but holding it in a ready position, like he'd been waiting by the door specifically for this. I remember we all looked at each other in the darkness of the woods, and I could see the fear in everyone's faces, even with barely any light. Someone whispered, "Oh shit," under their breath, and I think it might have been me. This had gone from a prank to something actually dangerous in about 2 seconds. The man did his inspection routine again, but this time it was slower, more methodical. He checked all the same spots as before, then started checking additional places, behind trees, behind his car, even crouching down to look under the vehicle. Then he walked to the exact center of his front lawn and just stopped. He stood there completely still, and we could see him looking around slowly, deliberately, like he was really thinking about where someone might hide. His head stopped moving when he was facing directly toward us, toward the woods. Me, Matt, and James all looked at each other with pure panic. Without saying a word, we all ducked lower, pressing ourselves against the ground, trying to become invisible. Had he seen us? Had the moonlight reflected off something? We held our breath. For what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 or 15 seconds, he just stared in our direction. Not moving, not saying anything, just staring. Then finally he turned and walked back into his house. But we didn't feel relief, because we saw him appear in his front window immediately after, standing there perfectly still like a statue, staring out toward the woods again, toward us. That's when we saw Mark. He was creeping back around from the side of the house where he'd been hiding, moving toward the front door. We wanted to yell at him to stop, to tell him the guy was watching, but we couldn't risk making any sound. We were terrified that if we yelled, the man would know exactly where we were, so we just watched in horror as Mark reached the door. He rang the bell one final time and immediately bolted, sprinting away from the house at full speed. But the man in the window didn't move. He just kept standing there, perfectly still, staring out toward us. 1 minute passed, then another. Still, he didn't move from that window. We couldn't see Mark anywhere. We assumed he'd made it back to safety somewhere on the other side of the street, but we were too scared to move or call out to confirm. Then suddenly we heard Mark's voice from somewhere across the street, yelling just one word: "Run!" We didn't understand what he meant for about half a second. Then we heard it. Footsteps, heavy, rapid footsteps, coming from behind us, coming from inside the woods. We all spun around at the same time and saw him, the man from the house. He'd somehow snuck across the street and into the woods while we were focused on the window. And now he was maybe 20 feet behind us, rifle in his hands, pointed directly at us. The next few seconds are kind of a blur in my memory. I remember running harder and faster than I'd ever run in my life. Branches whipping at my face, nearly tripping over roots and debris, my heart hammering so hard I thought it would explode. I could hear the others crashing through the woods beside me, all of us driven by pure terror and adrenaline. We burst out of the woods on the far side and saw Mark waiting for us on the street. We didn't stop running. The four of us sprinted together down the street, around corners, through yards, for what felt like miles but was probably 6 or 7 blocks. We didn't stop until we were absolutely certain we'd lost him, until our lungs were burning and our legs felt like they would give out. When we finally stopped, gasping for air, Mark explained what had happened. He'd seen the man slowly open his front door and carefully step outside while we were all focused on the window decoy. He'd watched the guy sneak across the street with his rifle and slip into the woods behind us, and that's when Mark had screamed for us to run. None of us could speak for a while. We were all shaking, partly from exertion but mostly from fear. We just had a gun pointed at us by a grown man who was genuinely trying to catch us. He could have shot one of us. He probably would have. And he probably would have claimed he was defending his property from intruders. And he might have been right to do it, legally speaking. We never reported what happened. I don't know why exactly. Maybe we were scared we'd get in trouble ourselves for trespassing. Maybe we were scared of what would happen if we made an enemy of a man who'd already proven he was willing to hunt down kids with a rifle. We just told a few friends about it quietly and tried to forget. The house was far enough from where any of us lived that we never really had to pass it again. We made sure of that, and we never ever did ding-dong ditch again. That prank had lost all its appeal. Looking back now as an adult, I realize how insanely lucky we were. That man had military-style tactics, setting up a decoy in the window while he flanked us. He was hunting us like animals. If Mark hadn't seen him, if he'd gotten just a little bit closer before we noticed, I genuinely don't know if all 4 of us would have made it out of those woods that night. I lived in what I can only describe as a house from hell for exactly 2 weeks and 3 days when I was 19 years old. I was in my first year of college, and my parents had agreed to pay for me to rent a small house instead of living in the dorms. I know that makes me sound spoiled, and honestly I was. But I paid for that privilege in ways I never could have imagined. The house itself was modest, maybe 100-200 square feet, nothing fancy or huge. It was in a decent neighborhood, the rent was reasonable, and when I first walked through it during the daytime with my parents, it seemed perfect. I was genuinely excited to have my own space, to feel independent, to be an adult. For the first few days after I moved in, everything was great. I was settling in, decorating, figuring out where everything should go. It felt like the start of something good. Then things started getting strange. I remember the exact moment it began. It was a Saturday, one of those grey, drizzly days where you have absolutely no motivation to go outside. The rain had started in the early morning and just never stopped, creating this constant white noise against the windows. I spent most of the day planted on the couch in my living room, binge-watching shows on my laptop and eating junk food. Just a lazy, unremarkable day. I'd been watching TV for several hours when I heard something that made me pause the video. It was a scraping sound, like something being dragged across the hardwood floor in the living room. The sound was clear enough and close enough that my first thought was that an animal had somehow gotten into the house. A raccoon or a cat, maybe. I sat up and looked around the entire room slowly, checking behind furniture, under tables, everywhere. Nothing. The room was empty. Just me and my irrational fear. I convinced myself I'd imagined it or that the house was just settling, making weird noises the way old houses do. I sat back down and resumed my show. That was the first occurrence, and if it had been the only one, I would have forgotten about it completely. But it wasn't the only one. The rain continued throughout the rest of the day and into the evening, which gave me every excuse to just stay in and keep watching TV. Around 8 p.m., when it was fully dark outside, I heard another sound. This one came from the kitchen. It sounded like something falling or being knocked over. The kitchen was separate from the living room, divided by a doorway, so I couldn't see what had made the noise. I stood up, and I'm embarrassed to admit this, but I grabbed one of the couch pillows to hold like some kind of pathetic weapon as I walked toward the kitchen. I reached the doorway and flipped on the light. There, in the middle of the kitchen floor, was a box of Cheerios lying on its side with hundreds of those little O-shaped pieces scattered everywhere across the tile. I stared at it, completely confused. I'd left that box on the counter that morning. I was sure of it. There was no way it could have just fallen off on its own. The counter wasn't tilted or anything, and even if it had somehow fallen, it would have landed near the counter, not in the middle of the floor, like someone had placed it there. I stood there for probably a full minute, just looking at this stupid cereal box, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Then I heard another sound, a creak. The specific kind of creak that old wooden floorboards make when someone puts weight on them. It came from near the kitchen table, maybe 6 feet away from where I was standing. I looked toward the table. Nobody was there. Nothing was there. Just an empty chair pulled out slightly from the table. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. This was different from the scraping sound earlier. This sounded exactly like a footstep, exactly like someone standing in my kitchen watching me. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking embarrassingly. Silence. Just the sound of rain on the windows and my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. I was officially freaked out now. Every little sound in the house suddenly seemed sinister, loaded with meaning. Was someone in here with me? Was I going crazy? I quickly cleaned up the Cheerios, my hands shaking slightly as I swept them into a trash bag. I kept glancing over at the spot where I'd heard the creak, half expecting to see someone standing there. When I finished cleaning, I basically ran back to the living room and turned the TV volume up louder than necessary, trying to drown out any other sounds the house might make. The thunder outside was getting louder as the storm intensified overhead. Normally I found thunderstorms relaxing, almost comforting. The white noise, the dramatic flashes of lightning, the feeling of being safe and warm inside while nature raged outside. That night I actually did find it soothing. It made me feel less alone somehow. The last thing I remember clearly is listening to a particularly loud rumble of thunder, thinking about how nice it sounded, and then I was waking up. I must have dozed off on the couch because when I opened my eyes, my laptop had gone to sleep and the room was darker. I felt groggy and disoriented. What had woken me up? I sat up slowly, trying to remember. Then I heard it, a distinct thud from upstairs, from the second floor. My bedroom was up there, along with a bathroom and an empty second bedroom I used for storage. I turned off the TV, and the sudden silence felt oppressive. I stood there in the dark living room for a moment, listening but didn't hear anything else. Whatever. I was tired and paranoid and ready to just go to sleep. I walked upstairs and went to bed, convincing myself that old houses just make noise and I needed to get used to it. The next day was normal. The day after that too. I started to relax again, to feel silly about how scared I'd gotten over some spilled cereal and creaky floorboards. Then came the next rainy day. I woke up that morning feeling like absolute death. My head was pounding, my stomach was churning, and every muscle in my body ached. It felt exactly like the worst hangover I'd ever had, except I hadn't been drinking. I hadn't been drinking in weeks, actually. But this felt worse than any hangover I'd ever experienced. I felt genuinely sick in a way I couldn't explain. The weather outside matched how I felt, dark and gloomy and oppressive. Rain streaked down the windows, and the sky was so overcast it barely looked like daytime. I couldn't bring myself to get out of bed, except to drag a trash can over next to the mattress in case I needed to throw up. I turned on the TV in my bedroom just to have some background noise, some sign of life in the house besides me, and I spent the entire day like that, just lying there, feeling miserable, drifting in and out of sleep. It was around noon when I first heard the sounds from above, from the attic. The attic access was actually in my bedroom ceiling, one of those pull-down ladder doors. Most of the attic space was directly over my room. I heard a thud, then nothing for a minute. Then another thud, then another. 3 or 4 distinct impacts like someone walking around up there, heavy-footed. Despite how sick I felt, despite the fact that moving made my stomach lurch, I forced myself out of bed. Something about those sounds triggered a primal fear response that overrode how physically awful I felt. I pulled the string to lower the attic ladder, and it unfolded with a metallic scraping sound that seemed too loud in the quiet house. I grabbed my aluminum baseball bat from the closet, something I'd brought from home and hadn't touched since moving in, and I started climbing. The attic stairs were narrow and steep, and I had to climb carefully while holding the bat. When I reached the top, I pulled the string for the light. A single bare bulb flickered on, illuminating the cramped space. The attic was unfinished, just exposed beams and pink insulation and plywood flooring. There were a few cardboard boxes scattered around that must have belonged to whoever lived here before me. I'd never bothered to look through them or move them. I stood there at the top of the ladder, bat raised, looking around carefully. Nothing moved. I could see pretty much the entire attic from where I stood, and there was no one up here, no animals either, just those old boxes and some dust. Whatever had made those sounds was gone now, or had never been there to begin with. The attic made me deeply uncomfortable in a way I can't fully articulate. Something about the shadows in the corners, the way the single light bulb left most of the space in darkness, the smell of old wood and insulation. I climbed back down quickly, folded the ladder back up, and returned to bed. My heart was racing, and my stomach was doing flips, partly from the sickness and partly from fear. I didn't hear anything else for the rest of the day. As evening came and the room got darker, I started to feel a little bit better physically. Not great, but better. I kept the TV on as I tried to sleep, using the noise and light as comfort. I think I finally fell asleep around 10 or 11 p.m. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night. The TV was still on, casting flickering blue light around the room. At first, I thought the TV had woken me, maybe a loud commercial or something. Then I heard it. A thud from above, from the attic. My whole body went rigid. I lay there in bed, perfectly still, listening. Another thud, then another. The sounds were slower this time, more deliberate. Step, pause, step, pause, step. Like someone was walking very carefully, very slowly across the attic floor, directly above my bed. This time, I didn't talk myself out of it. This time, I knew something was wrong. I threw off my covers and practically jumped out of bed. I yanked the string to pull down the attic ladder, grabbed my bat again, and climbed up. But this time, I was angry. I was tired of being scared in my own house. As I climbed, I started yelling. "I'm coming up there!" I shouted, trying to make my voice sound tough and threatening. "I have a bat. I'm not fucking around." I reached the top of the ladder and reached up to pull the light string, ready to swing at whoever or whatever was up there. But before my fingers touched the string, before the light came on, I heard something that made my blood turn to ice in my veins. A child's voice, giggling, high-pitched and gleeful and completely wrong, coming from the pitch-black attic right in front of me. I don't have words to adequately describe what I felt in that moment. Terror doesn't cover it. Fear is too simple a word. It was like every survival instinct in my body activated at once, screaming at me to get out, get away, run. My stomach dropped, my knees went weak, and without any conscious thought, I was moving. I don't remember climbing down the ladder. I don't remember running through my bedroom or down the stairs. I don't remember grabbing my keys or my phone. The next thing I knew, I was standing outside in the freezing rain, in just my pajamas, barefoot on the wet driveway, my whole body shaking violently. I pulled out my phone with trembling fingers and called my dad. "Come get me," I said when he answered. I must have sounded absolutely hysterical because he didn't ask questions. He just said he'd be right there. I told him the address through chattering teeth, standing in that rain, staring at my house, at the dark window of my bedroom where the attic was. I couldn't go back in there. I couldn't. My dad showed up maybe 20 minutes later. He wrapped a blanket around me and drove me home. I tried to explain what had happened, but I could barely get the words out. I kept saying there was something in the attic, and I heard a child laughing, and I can't go back there over and over. I'm sure I sounded insane. My parents could see how genuinely traumatized I was. I think that's what made them take me seriously, even though what I was saying made no logical sense. My mom just held me while I cried, and my dad said we'd figure it out in the morning. The next day I went back to the house with both my parents to pack up all my stuff. I'd only been there 2 weeks, so I didn't have that much. My dad wanted to go up into the attic to look around, but I begged him not to. I didn't want him up there. I didn't want anyone up there. We just grabbed everything we could as quickly as possible and left. I moved back home with my parents and commuted to campus for the rest of that semester. Eventually I got a dorm room the following year. I never went back to that house. I don't even like driving past that neighborhood. To this day, I'm completely convinced that what I experienced was paranormal. I don't care if people think I'm crazy or if there's some rational explanation. I know what I heard. A child's laughter in an empty attic in the middle of the night. I know how that house felt, the weight of it, the wrongness. Some houses aren't meant for the living. That house was one of them. I used to work as a maid for an old woman when I was 20. It was only supposed to be for a couple of weeks, but I didn't even last that long. She had a really big but very old house on a property that could have been beautiful if she'd actually taken care of it. She owned about 2 acres of land, surrounded by woods on 3 sides and the road on the other. The house itself was ancient, mostly made of wood, and the interior was incredibly dark. She would keep the blinds shut in most rooms for reasons I never understood. Sometimes I'd open them to let in some sunlight, only to find them closed again the next time I came in. She lit some rooms with candles instead of electric lights, which made the whole place feel even more like stepping back in time, and the wood floors creaked loudly just about everywhere you walked. The woman's name was Mel. She was around 70 years old. The work she had me do was mostly physical stuff she couldn't manage anymore. Sweeping, dusting, doing dishes, laundry, sorting mail, things like that. One weekend, Mel asked if I could sleep over for a night or 2. The house had 4 bedrooms, and she lived alone, so space wasn't an issue. I agreed, figuring it would be an easy way to make some extra money. This all takes place over the course of a Friday night and technically into Saturday morning. I arrived on Friday as usual, barely exchanging any words with Mel. I dropped my backpack full of clothes in the bedroom I'd be sleeping in. As I turned toward the door, I saw Mel standing in the doorway. She had this creepy way of just appearing without making any sound. She didn't say hello or anything. She just told me to clean that bedroom right away, then instructed me to straighten up the whole house. After that, she went upstairs and I didn't see her for the rest of the day. I could hear her walking around upstairs in her bedroom occasionally. It was odd, she would pace back and forth for long stretches. There were no TVs in the house, so I had no idea what she was doing up there. One thing I found really bizarre was how protective she was of the basement. She made it crystal clear that it was completely off limits. She didn't want me going down there under any circumstances. Night came and I went to bed early. This was before smartphones were common, so I didn't even know what time it was exactly. Probably 9 or 10 p.m. For the first few hours, everything was peaceful, though I had trouble falling asleep because the bed was incredibly uncomfortable. It felt like hours later when I started hearing footsteps outside my room on the creaky floors. It sounded like Mel was walking past my door very slowly. I figured she was just going to the bathroom. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps again, but this time they stopped right outside my door. I sat up in bed and listened. I could hear the floor creaking from the pressure of someone standing there on the other side of the door, and it was starting to seriously creep me out. Finally, she walked away. I heard her go down the stairs, and then I heard a door open and close from downstairs. I had a strong feeling it was the basement door. A while later, I heard the door open and close again, followed by heavy, slow footsteps coming back up the stairs. The footsteps came down the hall toward my room and stopped outside my door again. I sat up to listen. Then I heard the doorknob start to turn. I quickly laid back down and pulled the sheets over me, pretending to be asleep. I heard the door open. Mel took a few steps into the room, paused for what felt like forever, then finally left and went back to her own room. I was seriously disturbed at this point. Her behavior was beyond strange, but I waited about half an hour before I decided I absolutely had to see what was in that basement. I got out of bed as quietly as I could, tiptoed to the door, then crept down the stairs. I opened the heavy basement door, flipped on the lights, and slowly descended the basement stairs. When I reached the bottom step, I had to hold in a scream. There were 2 old wooden chairs in the center of the basement. Sitting in those chairs were what I can only describe as 2 decaying corpses, both wearing wigs. The sight of a bug crawling on one of them made me want to vomit. I forced myself to walk closer. I had to make sure I was really seeing what I thought I was seeing. Both corpses had men's wigs on. The larger one also wore a beret. I don't know much about decomposition, but based on their condition, I'd guess they'd been dead for close to a year. I felt my heart stop when I heard footsteps above me on the first floor. I had no time to reach the light switch. I dove behind one of the basement couches as I heard slow, heavy footsteps coming down the stairs, one creaky step at a time. I had my hands clamped over my mouth, trying not to make a sound. I heard Mel reach the bottom step. Then I heard her whisper my name. For just a second, I peeked around the couch and saw Mel already halfway across the basement, holding a large kitchen knife. I knew she'd be too slow to catch me if I ran, so I bolted for the stairs. She screamed my name and came after me as fast as she could. When I reached the first floor, I ran upstairs to grab my backpack from the bedroom. By the time I came back down, Mel was at the top of the basement stairs. I ran out the front door to my car. I started it, caught my breath for a second, and looked back at the house. Mel was standing in the front doorway, just watching me. I drove off that property and down the road as fast as I could, making it home within 10 minutes. Fortunately, I'd never given Mel any of my personal information, like my address or phone number, so she could never contact me again. If I had to guess, I'd say one of those corpses belonged to her dead husband that she'd mentioned to me a couple times. As for the other smaller corpse, I have no idea who it was. But regardless, it was the most disturbing thing I've ever witnessed, and something was seriously wrong with that woman.